Welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. Today we're going to be talking about some philosophy of religion. That's right, and we're going to do that via this work right here, this text. It is called Why Religion? A Personal Story by Elaine Pagels. So this author right here, Elaine Pagels, she is a historian of religion. And it talks about her experience doing history with religion, and it focuses on her personal story. It's a memoir, and she's specifically talking about her experience with extreme tragic loss. See, she lost her little child in some rare medical condition, really sad, and then shortly after, she also lost her husband in a hiking accident. And so she talks about that, and she ties it with this question of why religion? Like, why is religion still here? You know, we've been around for a long time, humanity. Civilization has developed, built upon itself. We have scientific advancements. We got advancements in philosophy, just all types of fields. You know, sociology, anthropology, medicine. More and more people are becoming agnostic, atheists. Yet still, religion is still around. Why isn't it not going away? And this is the question that Elaine Pagels, the author, tries to answer. Before we get to the quotes, because in the Black Ponder, we read quotes from the book. That's how we do it, and we add supplementary commentary via my discussion on the video, as well as the YouTube comments. You know, we do that. Let me start off with a little personal story of my own. So I was raised in the church as a Lutheran Christian myself, and you know, as a little kid, you know, I went to Sunday school, and eventually I went to what's known as confirmation class, which is study of religion via Bible reflection on the scriptures and the texts. Many denominations, not just Lutheran, many denominations partake in that class where they have you do that. I remember when I was taking that class, I was little, I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. And then my pastor, he had a book. He showed it to us, the little kids. It was a book of all these different kinds of gospels. Because, you know, there's the 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, John, Luke, right? And then he had a bunch of other gospels. He had the Gospel of James, right? He had the Gospel of Truth. It was just this book he had. And I was blown away. He turned my head upside down. I'm like, what? There's more to the Bible than just those 4 Gospels? And he was like, yeah, you want to take a look? And not only did he have those Gospels, he had all types of other books, like the Book of Enoch and all these other books that were not in the Bible that you just go to a store and buy. And honestly, you know, as a little kid, it blew me away because I didn't realize that there was more to the Bible than that. But actually there is, right? There are many, many books and texts that were written as part of Holy Scripture, which is now you don't see included in the standard Bible that you can just purchase at a store or get for free at like a hotel or something. And you have to ask yourself, well, you don't have to, but you know, you come to this question of why were those books left out? Who decided to leave those books out? For what reason? This is what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about a lot more. So let us begin with the first quote that I chose here. And we're going to talk about this. You know, it's going to be a very deep conversation about religion, about life experience, about suffering, about why religion is here, and what does it have to do with the human experience. So let me read you this first quote. This first quote I picked, it comes from the introduction of the book, page 14, Roman numeral, because it's the intro. So I'm starting here on the end of the first line of the 3rd paragraph. I could not continue to live fully while refusing to recall what happened, realizing that no one escapes terrible loss. And here she's referring to the loss of her young child and her husband. And since everything we experience shapes what we are capable of understanding, I've interwoven this personal story with the work that I love. Acknowledging such connections helps us understand the past and illuminate the present. So I want to repeat one of the key things I noticed in this section, in this little quote that I picked. Since everything we experience shapes what we are capable of understanding. What we experience shapes what we are capable of understanding. Let's remember that. That's a theme in the Black Ponder. The importance of the experience, of human experience, and how that plays into so much of what our lives are about. So let's remember that. But now we're going to get to the nitty-gritty of the text here. This is page 22. We are at the second paragraph here. Even the earliest surviving texts have been written decades after Jesus' death, and that none of them are neutral. I repeat that. They're written decades after Jesus' death, so not too far away, but none of them are neutral. They reveal explosive controversy between his followers, who loved him, and outsiders like the Roman senator Tacitus and the Roman court historian Suetonius, who likely despised him. So she's talking about her work as a religious historian, and she's checking out these texts. Not only the canonical books that we see in the Bible, the standard typical Bible you can find today, but also these other biblical texts, like the ones that were featured in the book that my pastor showed me when I was a little kid. None of these books are neutral. They're all written by people. They all have their own reason for being written. Some of these books that we find that were not included in the Bible were not included for a reason. And the reason why these texts are included and why these texts were written was due to people who followed Jesus and loved him, and also for people who did not like Jesus. And they also had influence toward the development of this Bible that we see today. And those people who likely despised him, as we see in this quote here. So what I'm getting at here is we got to acknowledge the historical context of the Bible, or any religious text for that matter, or basically anything for that matter, right? Context is important, and part of what is context is history. Once we begin to understand the historical context of something, like the Bible for instance, we can better understand the meaning behind it. We begin to understand that the Bible, and I'm just reading my notes here that I wrote, the Bible is a fundamentally interpreted document. And I say that because there were books that were included and there are books that were not included. And these writers who wrote the Bible, they wrote based off of their interpretation of what they saw and their motivations. And this is important to understand. Okay, we're going to get into why that's important as we continue. This is the third quote I picked. This is on page 46. This is the second line of the second paragraph. We've been told that controversies over hearsay were arguments over conflicting ideas. But now that I'd seen how issues of sexuality and gender, or any ideas that matter, are inextricably interwoven with how we live, what we choose, and how we set up a society, the history of ideas open up, so to speak, into three dimensions. Okay? So now we're getting to society and social context and these social issues that matter, okay? Like sexuality, gender, and how they play into the interpretation and the selective nature of the text within the Bible. Okay, listen to this. Those who struggled to shape the early Christian movement were contending with urgent and practical questions. Okay. What are these questions? Well, the author's going to lay them down for you. Who's in charge? Whose authority do we accept? Can women lead or only men? If arrested for being a Christian, should you admit it or accept a sentence of death? Or dodge the question and survive? To what group, if any, do you belong? With which group do you identify? Who chose the Gospels now included in the New Testament, and why? Who's in and who's out? And who has the right to say? Okay, these are questions that mattered, and the answers to these questions determined the structure of the Bible that we have today. The modern notion, the Christian notion, is that the Bible is God's word. That's God's word, right? It's His divine hand wrote down and transcribed what's in the Bible today. Absolute sacred text from His divine hand, right? That's how many Christians view the Bible. But if you actually study the Bible in its historic context, you begin to understand that, okay, but there was a lot of other scriptures that were left out of the Bible, taken out. And there was others that were put in front and center. Why? Was it God's will that did that? Well, if you actually look at the history, you'll see no, it's actually the people in power and highly influential people and people who were directly related to Jesus in terms of they were followers of Him or they were enemies, right, who didn't like Him. They had a hand in a play in how the structure of the Bible is that we see today, if you actually look and study it historically. And the questions that we list right now are these questions that were the determination of the structure. Who's in charge? What authority do we accept? I'll just repeat it. Can women lead or only men? These are social questions. Okay, social economic questions. And we have to take this into consideration. It's important to take these things into consideration because then you start to understand the meaning of behind this text. It's not just about, we can look at it from a moral standpoint, sure, but you also have to take into the fact of the historic context and the way these texts were used to develop a social order. Okay, that's important because when you just start to do that, then you can start to really understand the true meaning of the Bible. And that's not to take away from the moral lessons that the Bible has to give. I'm being a Christian myself, but you got to look at the Bible in a realistic fashion. Some things that are written in the Bible, you have to understand they were written to sustain a social order, and that's important. But let me continue here. We're on the third paragraph here, same page 46. Now that the people whom traditionally minded scholars dismissed as the crazies, okay, could speak for themselves, we could include their voices in the conversation. We're talking about the people who wrote these religious texts, like the Gospel of James, for instance, that was not included in the standard Bible we see today. These people were the crazies, cast by, society, popular society. But now, historians like this author, we can actually see what they were actually saying and how that played into the understanding of the interpretation of the Bible. From now on, instead of writing primarily about ideas, I'd have to show how ideas are inseparably woven into actual social codes. We just talked about that. And so into behavior. Although no one, so far as I knew, had ever read these sources that way, now I had to. And so began the research that eventually would lead to the book I wanted to write. And she's talking about her very popular book in the world of the history of religion, that field, the Gnostic Gospels. And so she wrote a whole book on the Gospels that were not included in the Bible, but were part of the whole formation of Christianity nonetheless. But we're going to keep going here. We're on page 49 now. We're going to start on the third line. Why had I, or any of us, unthinkingly accepted what didn't make sense and contradicted our own experience? How, I wonder, had sexual attitudes about marriage, divorce, homosexuality, and abortion that we'd grown up with, all of them now rapidly changing, been made to feel as natural as if they'd been built into the structure of the universe? How had we not been aware of how culturally conditioned those attitudes are? And here what's being discussed here is when we read things in the Bible, Christians for instance, and we read, like, for example, there's a part of the Bible that says you can't wear wool. Wearing wool is a sin. Or you can't get a tattoo, right? Things of that nature, and we just take them just as they are, like, oh, that's divine commandment. And we just take them for granted. Now, a lot of Christians, they don't want to really think past the actual meaning behind what's being said, so they just kind of like gloss it over, like, oh, whatever. The Bible is divine word, yeah, but what about this? Whatever. The Bible is divine word, right? So what the author is saying here, Pagels, is she's saying that why do we unthinkingly accept what doesn't make sense? These things don't make sense. However, you unthinkingly accept this, but if you think about it, use critical thinking, it does make sense in the social context, in the historical context, and how these scriptures, these holy scriptures, when they were written at that time, were about developing a social order where these things were important and were important to keeping that social order under control, right? So when you think about it in that way, you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So then you have to ask yourself, well, is this something that applies today? Or is this something that should we include this in what's really moral or what's really ethical? So basically she's asking you why, and in herself even, about ideas about sexuality, marriage, divorce, abortion. We just accept these things without critically thinking about them or thinking about the historical context of when they were written. So that's important to do, right? Because again, when you do that, you start understanding the true meaning behind these documents, these scriptures, these holy texts. So I'm just going to keep going. Let's continue. Page 51. This is the fourth to the last line. Okay, so she is a historian of religion. She mostly does work with Christianity, but she also does work with all types of other religions. And what she's talking about here is she encountered this belief system of the people known as the Dinka. So she's talking about the creation story of this people called the Dinka, right? And this is what she has to say. What impressed me most about Dinka creation stories was how practical in italics, so it was emphasis, how practical they are. They show people how to live, what matters, what to do, and what to avoid. Social order. So we're getting into this idea about the social context of these religious documents. Part of their motivation is to show people how to live. In that way, it's very practical because it's providing this practical application of social order. So we're on page 52, and let me read you this. That goes with what we're talking about here. I found a worn copy of Time magazine and read it from cover to cover. What fascinated me most were letters to the editor protesting a previously led story on bisexuality in America. To my surprise, 4 out of 6 of those letters involved the Genesis creation story to prove that only heterosexuality is natural, quote, and right, quote. I began to see that what my father had dismissed as foolish old folktales, and her father, who was not religious at all, and who was saying like, oh, religion is just these like foolish old folktales, and he was very dismissive about religion. But what she's beginning to see is, and I continue to quote, are not, as he assumed, simply science for dummies, quote. Stories that primitives, quote, tell to explain the creation of the natural world. Instead, creation stories help to create the cultural world. Okay, let me repeat that. Instead, creation stories help create the cultural world. Okay, by transmitting traditional values. And although I hadn't been brought up to take the Genesis story, she wasn't raised religious. She got into religion later on in her life. I hadn't been brought up to take the Genesis stories literally. The discomfort I'd felt acknowledging any attraction for a woman showed me that I'd absorbed, quite unconsciously, the cultural messages the Adam and the Eve stories have conveyed for thousands of years. So even on a subconscious level, people who aren't even religious get cues from these social norms that these religious texts push. And we have to acknowledge that, even as me being a religious person, that these stories, religious texts, are pushing these social norms to enforce a social order. And that influence goes beyond the religious. And that we gotta acknowledge that. And I'm gonna get later on to why that acknowledgement is important, even as a Christian. So she continues, why do people continue to tell such stories to this day? What do these stories mean to them? And then she talks about how later, and we're just gonna keep on page 52, he's talking about, she's in a taxi, and she talks to the taxi driver, and there's protests about people who are protesting against homosexuality, and the taxi driver is saying, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? This guy might be religious, he might not be religious, but he's just using that social cue, that Adam and Eve story that everybody who's like many people know, and it's so ingrained in popular culture that you kind of just take it unconsciously for granted. And it provides a social order. You immediately begin, when you encounter experiences of homosexuality, for instance, the Adam and Eve image immediately pops into your mind, whether you're religious or not, because it's been so ingrained in our brains. So I continue here, the fifth to the last line here on page 52. Countless people, religious or not, reflexively turn when they encounter something that makes them uncomfortable. For creation stories claim to tell how the world was meant to be, or how it should be, how it was in the beginning. Okay, let me continue here. Page 53, we're at the 9th line of the 2nd paragraph. I could see that it is not so much about how God created nature, but how such stories created a culture. How, for example, this story speaks of the world as originally good, quote unquote, intelligently planned by a beneficent creator, thus teaching its readers to celebrate the world's beauty and worship its creator. And by telling how God worked for 6 days, then rested, the story teaches its hearers that they too should work for 6 days and rest on the 7th, the holy day of Sabbath, a ritual that marks them as God's people, set apart from the nations. And these are just examples of using religion as a tool for social order. That's what this is, okay? What's another example? We're going to go on the 3rd paragraph here. Whether we believe them or not, they are transmitted in our cultural DNA, powerfully shaping our attitudes toward work, gender, sexuality, and death. The first story, for example, tells how God first commands the original human couple to use their sexual energy. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. Reading this now, we can see that much in the Bible that sounds strange, or at least alien in contemporary values. Like when I was talking about, a part in the Bible, the Old Testament talks about how wearing wool, that's a sin, or getting a tattoo, that's a sin. And all these things that are said in the Old Testament that in contemporary times, like, that doesn't make any sense. But what Pagels is saying here, the author, it makes much more sense when we understand the situation of the people who first told these stories. This first creation account, likely told and retold long before it was written down, some 3,000 years ago, transmits the cultural code of nomadic people, whose survival and well-being depended on fertility, too precious a resource to waste, not only the fertility of their herds of goats and sheep, but also of themselves. The legal codes, now bound with Genesis into the Hebrew Bible, reinforce that primary command, treating any non-procreative use of sexual energy, for example, sexual relations with someone of the same gender or with a prostitute, or spilling semen on the ground, as abominations to the Lord. Quote, some of which could get you killed. So we're talking about historical context and why that's important. But I'm going to keep on going with this, right? Because we got to understand this as religious people. And I'm at the last line of page 55 here. Even thousands of years ago, some people were asking, why take that story literally when doing so makes no sense? And now she's bringing up the notion of how people were studying these scriptures, these holy texts, even back then, like back when they were like newly written, and they were trying to make sense out of it all. And now I'm at page 56, we're at the beginning of the 2nd paragraph. Not everyone who asks those questions dismiss the story as nonsense. Some read it as myth or allegory, inviting the spiritually adventurous to plunge into its hidden depths. So what she's talking about here is, okay, even back then and even to this day, there are people who understand like, okay, there's a historical context for this. And we shouldn't take everything at face value. We should study and really understand the social meaning behind these texts. But even when we take in consideration that, there were people then and now that don't completely dismiss these religious texts and messages that they have as just nonsense. Some people do find spiritual meaning in these texts, even with that in mind. You know, people like me, people like the author here, and you know, she's saying even people thousands of years ago. Discovering these long suppressed sources invites us to uncover hidden continents of our own cultural landscape. And when we do, we gain perspective on reflexive attitudes that we may have unthinkingly inherited, just at a time when countless people are exploring a much wider range of gender identity, letting go of the assumption that gender difference, as our culture defines it, is built into our DNA. Why is it so difficult for us to accept what she's talking about here? Well, it's because of the assumptions that were ingrained in our minds socially due to things like these religious stories. And here we can understand our cultural development. So I put in my notes here that I write in margins, try to understand what's being said. We need to interpret the meaning behind the scriptures and figure out how to best apply them to today. You know, we can't take the scriptures and just read them as if they're written thousands of years ago, because that's a different social historical context. We need to read them using critical thinking, historical analysis, and understanding of the social economic situation that we have today. By doing that, we can derive like constructive, progressive meaning with these religious texts. So how do we do that? Taking into account the historical context and this motivation of keeping social order. How do we do that? Okay. Well, we're going to continue. We got a long way to go still. You know, I'm going to say this is the fourth selection of quotes I picked, but I mean, I've lost track of the amount of quotes I picked. So the next quote that I picked is on page 67, and it is at the end, the second to last line. But before we read that, we're going to now talk about her experience with personal loss, right? And how she dealt with the death of her child and the death of her husband. And you know, and what was that like, and how could she deal with that while studying religion? You know, while studying Christianity, and she was trying to find a way to deal with this extraordinary trauma, pain, heartache. You know, just this tremendous suffering, unimaginable suffering of losing such people that you love so much. She's just trying to figure out some sort of answers, or trying to figure out, like, you know, how she can deal with this. And she finds things that help her through this very difficult process. So let me read you what she says here. I realize the truth. I'd rather feel guilty than helpless. For guilt, however painful, often masks a deeper agony, even more unbearable. So for her, she started like going into this toxic feeling of guilt. Like, she was like, well, if only I did this, would my loved ones still be alive? What if I did this? And you know, didn't make any sense, right? Because the loss of her loved ones wasn't her fault, but she was desperately trying to find reasons. And her conclusion is that the reason why we do this, because people do that too when they experience vast amounts of suffering. Oftentimes they blame themselves, and then other people tend to blame others. What happens is we try to find meaning behind suffering. Like, oh, it's got to be somebody's fault that this happened, right? Because if it's nobody's fault, if you're suffering this large, tremendous amount of pain that's like unimaginable, for instance, that's hard to comprehend, hard to take into consideration. Like, it's hard to fathom, you know. So even though you know, that's horrible too, to feel guilty about something of that magnitude. For her, it was better to hold on to that guilt than to experience this other truth of, well, it just happened, right? And it wasn't my fault, and and this feeling of helplessness, right? And we're gonna go into that. We're gonna go into that, this reality here. So remember what we talked about before when I mentioned about these holy texts in the creation stories, and how part of the objective of why they were written, right, was to keep a social order, or the powers that be, the people who hold this social economic power, the people in charge that are like the enforcers of society, they use these stories to enforce a way of culture, right? How culture should be, social norms. So with that being said, I'm on page 95 here. We're on the 7th line. I'm going to read you what the author wrote here. The author is quoting an anthropologist by the name of Clifford Geertz. And Geertz, he told her, the work of culture is to make suffering sufferable. The work of culture, is to make suffering sufferable. So again, we go to this idea that people go through a lot of hardship, and some people more than others. We all go through hardship, but there's people who go through some really intense hardship, and how much hardship. You can't even, there's no measure to it. It's the sad truth. I mean, you can't even put like a metric on it, right? It's too much. You can't even try to imagine it. You can't imagine it. It's unimaginable what a lot of people go through. And so you're trying to find some sort of justification. Why is this happening? Why? That's hard to deal with too, right? So a lot of times we tell ourselves these stories, or these stories are socially ingrained in us to try and handle that reality of okay, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why do people have to go through all this? And part of these creation stories are a way to explain that. But we really have to think about, this question of why this type of suffering exists, and there's this idea that there's a reason behind it, or there's some sort of justification behind it. We really have to start to begin there, as we really have to start to think about that as religious people. I'm talking about the religious people in the audience now, right? That's a question that we have to ask, and we have to ask ourselves what we've been taught as Christians, as religious people. Is that really what the message of Christianity? And where are we getting this message from? We're getting it from the Bible, but let's think about the Bible and how these stories are curated and interpreted and structured and honestly censored, right? Because again, there are texts that were left out of the Bible, right? There are stories that were not included, and then there are other stories that were given special treatment. And a huge part of the Bible is the idea of, or this explanation of suffering, right? And we have to think about, okay, what is this message? Why is it being told to us? And we have to really critically think about that. And let's talk about the messages and the themes and the lessons, the existence of suffering, right, that were not included in the Bible, that were dismissed, put aside. And why were they dismissed? Why were they put aside? Who did it? Who made that decision? And for what reason? Right? This is what I'm getting at. And once we begin to understand that, we begin to understand, okay, there's this social motivation behind this what's happening here. Well, let's continue. Okay, we're on page 100. We're in the 4th paragraph. We're in the 4th line. I had begun to investigate how Jews and Christians deployed the story of Adam and Eve to sanction and to censor sexual practices. But now I was driven toward the primary question that the story addresses. Why do we suffer? And why do we die? At the same time, a more intimate question pressed into the foreground. Why do we feel guilty, even when we've done nothing to bring on illness or death? I think that's worth repeating. A general question. Why do we suffer? Why do we die? personal question, more personal. Why do we feel guilty, even when we've done nothing to bring on illness or death? Okay, think about these things. Even when we've done everything possible to prevent it. Okay, even when that happens, suffering feels like punishment. It feels like punishment. This is what the author is saying, doesn't it though? Why? Part of it is the social conditioning, and part of it is the stories that we've been told. Suffering feels like punishment, and we're told that. So I would like to push the question on to you. Why? Why do you feel that way? Why is that the case? Okay, let's continue this philosophical examination. We're on page 102. We're at the fifth to the last line here. Even though blaming the victim or the victim's parents may be absurd, rationally speaking, how often in emergency rooms do we hear the question, whether unspoken or spoken out loud, how could this happen? What has he done, she done, or what have we done to deserve this? Shaken by emotional storms, I realized that choosing to feel guilt, however painful, somehow seemed to offer reassurance that such events did not happen at random. Okay? If guilt is the price we pay for the illusion that we have some control over nature, many of us are willing to pay it. The author was willing to pay that price. She's talking about the loss of her little child and her husband. But I'll continue this quote. To begin to release the weight of guilt, I had to let go of whatever illusion of control it pretended to offer, and acknowledge that pain and death are as natural as birth, woven inseparably into our human nature. Realizing this, Freud, we're talking Sigmund Freud, the famous psychologist, declared that humans created the gods out of fear, repeating what the Roman poet Lucretius said thousands of years earlier. When popularizing the teaching of his mentor, the philosopher Epicurus, Lucretius wrote, "Poor humankind, to have invented the gods and thrown in a bad temper as well." We're going to skip down 4 lines. Like Freud, Lucretius hoped to liberate people from religion, which he saw simply as a web of illusion, invented by children afraid of the dark. Well, whatever the rationalists say, and whatever the doctors could tell us about how cells break down, nothing they said could satisfy the need to find meaning. We're on to page 104. This is the second paragraph. What is clear is that meaning may not be something we find. We found no meaning in our son's death, or in the death of countless others. The most we could hope was that we might be able to create meaning. Now I'm going to skip down to the last sentence of this paragraph. Many other parents whose children have been killed by gun violence, war, drunk drivers, or disease also choose to create meaning by working to spare other people unfathomable losses like their own. Let me read you what I put in my notes. There is no meaning in suffering. That's a popular opinion of religious people, Christians specifically. There's no meaning in suffering. Rather, religion is what some people choose to turn to when suffering, to create meaning, to address that emotional need that rationality cannot address. Now we're on page 105. This is the last sentence of the first paragraph. The work I'd chosen also felt like a kind of yoga. And the work she's talking about is Historian of Religion. A practice of focus and discovery that can show how countless people throughout the ages contend with questions of meaning, perhaps even a way of spinning straw into gold, like Rumpelstiltskin. So her work involves this search for meaning when people go through tremendous suffering and trauma and hurt. Not necessarily trying to make meaning out of the suffering, but to create meaning despite the suffering. So I'm going to go to page 161 here. This is the last sentence of the page here. People who interpret human conflict in terms of good against evil, God against Satan, obviously find it much easier to kill those they identify as evil, even to insist that killing them is morally necessary. Now we're on page 162, the ninth line. Only imagination, apparently, can evoke the visceral, powerful responses required to wage war, incite terrorism, and acts of violence, whether triggered by fear, paranoia, or patriotic emotion. No wonder that all over the world throughout human history, tribes and peoples have relied on religious traditions, rituals, music, narratives to arouse the passions that prove so useful, even indispensable, in war. And now we'll go to the beginning of page 163. Having been unable to deny reality, even when I most wanted to, I'm convinced that we cannot interpret our own experience, much less that of our culture, without simultaneously engaging in both imagination and reality. I put in my notes here. Our interpretation of religion based on our social context is where the meaning of religion derives. Religious meaning depends on society. So what do we talk about here? What we're talking about here is that our human experience oftentimes defies rationality. Now, what does that mean? Like, you can explain things. You can explain basically anything in a calm state of mind. But when you're actually going through like really intense personal suffering and trauma and hurt, like the experience defies rationality. That experience, that when you're going through intense suffering, like this author, for instance, where she shares her loss of her child and her husband, that kind of pain defies rationality for her. You can't explain it in rational terms. So now she's like, okay, there needs to be some sort of religion. She turns to religion, but really it's this imaginative aspect that she had to go to deal with that kind of suffering that she went through. And this is where we begin to answer the question, why religion? It's because the human experience, there are things that today we still can't explain in rational terms, right? There's experiences that are beyond, we can't explain them, right, in the logic. And we have to, the imagination has to take over at that point to try to create some sort of meaning or some sort of way to move forward. And that could go either way, because she talks about war and, terrorism and, extreme paranoia, extreme violence. It could go either way. You can create meaning, and that is both bad and good. But this is where she's talking about why religion still exists, because the extremity of human experience, people turn to religion to handle that extremity. So I'll continue. We're on page 177, and this is the beginning of the third paragraph here. Once, when I spoke to this to another scholar, he objected. Like me, he'd first come to know these sayings through historical analysis, seeking to take into account all available evidence in order to understand them in their own linguistic, cultural, historical context. But although such scholarship is necessary and valuable, it offers only limited understanding. I choose to concentrate on these specific sources not only because they open up new historical perspectives, and she's talking about the texts, the holy scriptures that were not included in the standard Bible we see today, what's known as these Gnostic Gospels, the same text that my pastor had, and my mind was blown. I was like, oh wow, there's actually other religious texts that were included in the Bible and were taken out. That's crazy. She studies those texts. So I'll continue with the quote. They open up new historical perspectives, but also and primarily because I find them so compelling. So she finds them compelling herself. However difficult it is to investigate a source we know only from a handful of Greek fragments and from a translation in Coptic. Coptic is like an old language that was spoken in Egypt a while back. I love the challenge. While I work on these sayings, they work on me. My colleague's question also clarified that for many of us, the use of such poetic and mysterious words is precisely that we may discover our own experience in them. Okay, let me repeat that. The use, quote, of such poetic and mysterious words is precisely, italics, so emphasis, precisely that we may discover our own experience in them. Discover our own experience in them. Many of us read them as we might read the Bible, the Quran, the sutras, or the poems that we love, not primarily for whatever they meant in the past, or for whoever wrote them down, but for what they might mean to us today. Or now we're starting to answer this question. Why religion? What we're looking for may not be anything supernatural, as we usually understand what we call spiritual, quote. Instead, as one saying in Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, suggests, we may find that what we're seeking right where we are. Jesus says, recognize what is before your eyes, and the mysteries will be revealed to you. And listen to this quote. What each person finds there may be must be different. So I put in my notes, scriptures are constructive when they can be applied to the diverse experiences of humanity, the myriad array of human contexts. Okay? Everybody goes through something, right? Human experience is diverse. It's extremely varied, right? So everybody is going to interpret what they read in their own way. For many people, how they read these religious texts, and they discover a meaning for them that tailors to their experience. And this poetic and mysterious way of writing, the way the scriptures are written, they are able to derive meaning and answers to these questions. Maybe not so much answers, but comfort, right? And meaning, they're able to create a way to move forward, right? That they couldn't find anywhere else. And what's important to understand, what we're saying, is that each person finds their individual meaning, and it must be different because each person's experience is different. So with this quote that I'm about to read you, she's talking about one of the texts that were left out of the Bible, that were censored out, basically, the gospel of truth. Not the gospel of Mark, Luke, John, or Matthew, right? The gospel of truth. Okay? In the gospel of truth, she's able to find or understand the nature of suffering in existence. Okay, and this is what she finds. This is her findings from her historical analysis of this gospel that wasn't included in our current Bible, but holds a lot of meaning. So let me go to page 200 here. Second paragraph, the second line I'm going to begin. When all beings begin to search for the one from whom they come forth, they couldn't find him. Feeling abandoned, not knowing where they came from, they suffered anguish and terror, like children wandering in the dark, searching in vain for their lost parents. As this gospel tells it, what separates all beings, including ourselves, from God is not sin. Instead, what frustrates our longing to know our source is its transcendence and our own limited capacity for understanding. Yet when these beings, or when we realize that we can't find our way home, don't know where we came from or how we got there, we feel utterly lost. Overwhelmed by grief and fear, we may rush into paths that lead nowhere. More lost than ever, imagining that there's nothing beyond the confusion we see in the world around us. At this point, the gospel of truth turns toward a drama of cosmic redemption. When the Father sees his children terrified and suffering, ensnared by negative energies, he sends his Son, the hidden mystery, Jesus Christ, that's good quotes, to show them a path and bring them back into the Father, into the Mother, Jesus of the infinite sweetness. And although, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, ignorant and violent rulers of this world tortured and crucified Jesus, the Father overturned their conspiracy, transforming even their hideous crime into a means of grace. To show this, the gospel of truth reframes the vision of the cross from an instrument of torture into a new tree of knowledge. Here, Jesus' battered body, quote, nailed to a tree, unquote, is seen as fruit on a tree of knowing the Father, quote unquote, which, unlike that tree in paradise, doesn't bring death but life to those who eat from it. Thus, the author suggests that those who participate in the Eucharist, eating the bread and drinking the wine, that symbolically speaking are Jesus' flesh and blood, quote, discover him in themselves, unquote, while he, quote, discovers themselves in him, unquote. I found here a vision that goes beyond what Paul calls, and Paul, we're talking about the Apostle Paul, the message of the cross. Instead of seeing suffering as punishment, the gospel suggests that seen through the eyes of wisdom, suffering can show how we're connected with each other and with God. And now we're talking about ecology. That's another theme in the Black Ponder. The reality of ecology, the understanding that we are all interconnected with each other. Next page, page 202. This is the second paragraph. The author of the Gospel of Truth rejects the picture of God that both images imply. God as a harsh divine judge who sent Jesus into the world to die for our sins. Instead, he suggests that loving and compassionate Father sent Jesus to find those who were lost and bring them back home. Now I'm going to move down to the third paragraph, the last sentence. This vision suggests that suffering and death are simply the necessary cost of entering into human life, motivated by love. The gospel of truth, then, is all about relationships. How, when we come to know ourselves, simultaneously we come to know God. Implicit in this relationship is the paradox of gnosis, not intellectual knowledge, but knowledge of the heart. What first we must come to know is that we cannot fully know God, since that source far transcends our understanding. But what we can know is that we're intimately connected with that divine source, since in him we live and move and have our being. Now we're on page 203, the end of the fourth line. This is your story and mine, quote unquote. For as we've seen when the storyteller talks about, quote, all beings, he's also talking about us. This is the next paragraph. Those who lack the sense of connection with others and with the source of all being live, he says, as if in a nightmare. Those who recognize this story as their own, as I do, may realize that this nightmare parable coincides with experience. We all know that people who feel isolated, overwhelmed by terror and anger, can turn their own nightmares into horrific reality, from the inner cities of our nation to war-ravaged cities throughout the world. On the other hand, when we recognize how connected we are with one another and with all beings, this author says we may say from the heart that you are the perfect day. In you dwells the light that does not fail. And recognizing this, in turn, impels us to act in ways that acknowledge those connections. Now we're on page 204. Right, and this is going to be the second line of this third paragraph. Instead of seeing suffering as punishment or somehow as good for you, this author sees it rather as Buddhists do, as an essential element of human existence, yet one that may have the potential to break us open out of who we are. My own experience of the nightmare, the agony of feeling isolated, vulnerable, terrified, has shown that only awareness of that sense of interconnection restores equanimity, even joy. But while this myth speaks to my condition, many other sources do as well, and it may not speak to yours. Through teaching and talking with friends, I've come to see how differently various people interpret their lives, depending on temperament and situation. As psychologist William James shows in his classic book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, James wrote the varieties of religious experience after he recovered from a crippling depression by clinging to certain religious slogans, even though he says that he didn't actually believe them. Still, the experience was so compelling that it led him to investigate case studies of conversation and to challenge Freud's view that religion is nothing but illusion. James defined religion instead as a person's total reaction upon life. Now let me read you page 206. This is the sixth line. People of different temperaments, situations, and levels of insight need different kinds of spiritual food. Page 208. The last sentence of the second paragraph. I'm aware that anything I say can speak to you only as it resonates through what you have experienced yourself. Yet even within those limits, we may experience mutual recognition. So what has been said here? Try to explain it as the light gets weird here. That's fine. So what we're saying is, look, when you begin to read these other Gospels that were not included in part of the canonical Bible that we have today, suffering is just part of the human experience. It's just, a consequence of human life, or just existing in the world in general. There is no meaning behind it. It's just part of the human experience. And in that way, we don't derive meaning in suffering itself. Rather, we derive meaning despite suffering, right? We try to find we create some sort of meaning out of the horrible experience that we go through. And a lot of this experience that we go through is beyond rationality. And this is what the author mentions as the paradox of gnosis, right? Not intellectual knowledge, but knowledge of the heart. Intellectual knowledge can only take you so far, right? But when a lot of human experience, you have to begin to find other means to move forward beyond just intellectual knowledge of the heart. And for that, a lot of people turn to religion. That's why religion is still around. Oh, there I go. I'm getting good light because I'm holding this book right here in the light. That's good. So I would like to encourage you, check out some of the Gnostic Gospels if you're interested. If you really want to seriously study religion, particularly Christianity. Also, when you read religious texts, take in consideration the historical context and also the motivation behind why these texts were written. And question why these texts were written. Who wrote them? Why is it that we have some religious texts and not others? What's that all about? And don't let that use of religious texts discourage you from finding meaning in religion, because religion has a lot to offer that's positive, but taken the wrong way, it also can bring about a lot of negativity. It's true. It's all about how we critically think about things. Oh, I got it. Let me do this. It's all about how we critically think about things and how we interpret things. And, it's about including all of human experience and taking seriously the human experience and not being dismissive of what people go through. So this is a very good book. I would highly recommend it. Here it is, Why Religion by Elaine Pagels. Well, you've been watching The Black Ponder. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.